Also, our keynote speaker for the 2021 Library Symposium, Professor Kanshukan Rajaratnam. He is the director of the School of Data Science and Computational Thinking. Still the only one in Africa, is it? Oh, okay. But certainly, you know, the first school for data science at Stellenbosch University, and at least maybe not, also not in the Western Cape. But in any case, Professor Kanshu is the inaugural director of the School for Data Science and Computational Thinking at Stellenbosch, as I've already said. He holds a BSc Engineering in Chemical Engineering from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, a Master's of Science in Industrial Engineering from the National University of Singapore, and a PhD in Systems Engineering from the University of Virginia, where he received the most outstanding doctoral student prize from the department. His research interests are in the intersection of data science, operations research, and banking finance. He is a member of the South African Young Academy of Science and has a Y rating from the National Research Foundation. His vision is to create a data school that is sustainable and impactful. We're looking now forward to Professor Kanshu, who will, the title of his presentation and talk this morning is Open Data, What We Learned from the Pandemic. Professor.
Thank you, Ellen. Thanks for that introduction. So it's quite nerve-wracking to speak to, librarians, right? Because the librarians and people who work in the library are kind of the unthanked staff members of all our success. And every academic wouldn't be where they are without the library services. So, it is a bit scary to speak here. But it's also delightful that I would be able to maybe give my thoughts to how you do your job, right? Because, I wouldn't be here without that. Secondly, it's also nice that I'm able to speak here today without somebody telling me to unmute myself. So, I can speak with, from the get-go. So when I was asked to speak at the library symposium, I thought to myself, what could I offer to this group? Could it be artificial intelligence, data science, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And my experiences with the library services has always been that they are one step ahead of you, right? So what can I give you that you don't know already? And the only thing I can give you there is my experience, right? So I want to speak to you about my experience with data during this time of the pandemic, or this last 1.5 years. So up on the screen, I have a cartoon there where we have one dog who has a Confederate flag, implying, something about his intelligence level, maybe. And it says, "I'll take a bullet for my country." And then you have another dog with a nursing cap on, also implying something about higher IQ over there, saying, "You won't even take a needle for your neighbors, sit down," right? And what we've seen during the pandemic is a wide amount of fake news, bad data, bad science, etc. And how do we as researchers and library services think about fake news and bad data and open data, etc.? Well, when I saw this picture, somebody then commented the following: "Would you put all these doctors in that baseball cap too?" And they had a list of names here. And this is not, this is not the whole list because I just couldn't fit it on the page. But it's interesting, there's quite a wide range of people here. Some of them, said to be the most cited epidemiologists, 2 Nobel Prize winners, one of the inventors of the mRNA technology. I'm not sure how true that is, but this is what the retort from the person is, that these people apparently don't agree with vaccination. So should one get vaccinated or not? And so you have a lot of these kind of data and information present in the internet at the moment, and it's hard for people to make decisions. And it's hard for researchers to think about their research when there's so many voices or opposing voices very often or sometimes unscientific voices shouting back at you. So when I looked at this, this set of names, I'm going to choose one name here because of time, right? But there are quite a few names that are just wrong here. But the one name that really stood up to me was Dr. Kary Mullis, Nobel Prize winner, inventor of the PCR test. And they're trying to tell us, or the person who posted this is trying to tell us, that Dr. Kary Mullis was not pro-vaccination. So what's going on here? So I did a little bit of digging. And of course, the first thing you do is search for Dr. Kary Mullis on the web. And if you look carefully, you'll see he was the inventor of method used to test for COVID, didn't say. So if I had to click on that, it would tell me the truth about what he said and what he didn't say. But there's something more interesting than that. He died on the 7th of August, 2019. Okay, so you caught on already. There's no way he could have said anything about the novel coronavirus, right? We only got to know about the novel coronavirus, at least the public, in December of the previous year or January of last year, and that was also at that point not sequenced. So there's no way that he would have said anything on his deathbed, right? So you see a lot of these fake news, and I have this interest in fake news and in open data. My name is Kanshukan Rajaratnam. I want to talk to you, as Ellen said, on open data and what we learned from the pandemic, and really is what I learned from the pandemic, right? So 2020 was a terrible year for all of us, right? It also brought about some opportunities, but it was really hard. Suddenly, we couldn't see people face to face. We were scared of our own health. We were scared of dying in some cases, or in a lot of cases, we saw people who were not economically active and didn't have access to food, etc. But the pandemic also saw real, other bad things, not related to economics or health, which is the proliferation of fake news, of irresponsible science, rise of YouTube qualified scientists. Apparently, they're all my friends too, and they're all on my Facebook wall, right? And so, they are receiving information out there that is wrong or biased, and it is the role of the scientists and library services, in some sense, to bring them back to reality, right? While keeping open conversations going, right? And what we saw last year was really a pandemic of disinformation. Never mind we had to deal with COVID-19, we had to deal with disinformation. And so I believe there's a role for open data and how we think about it in the libraries and in institutions in general. By institutions, I really mean higher education institutions. My experience with library is most of that is already thought about, but then there are certain things, of course, one can always improve because I experienced something. It's about me. No, I'm kidding. And then I want to talk to you about the SU Data School, because I like talking about the data school. Okay. So let me define open data first. It's freely available, is without copyright or control, and freely shared and used. So it's accessible, anybody can go access it without worrying about copyright and control, and then use it and share it with other people as well, both the raw data as well as the analysis of the raw data. Most people say it requires attribution, right? I don't think that is what is open data, but that's how open data should be used. And the reason for that is, if I publish a paper, or if I make a statement with some data, the people who read it must know where it came from. Otherwise, I could create fake news, right? And so I don't think the owner of the data necessarily requires attribution, but from the user side, it requires attribution to say, this is where I got the data, so people can then go and check the work, right? It must fulfill regulatory requirements. So it must be privacy preserving. There's a whole lot of regulatory requirements that are out there now, from South Africa to Brazil to Europe, etc. And it's got to fit wherever the data is being used. And it's really the same ethos as open access software, open science, etc. So I use Python a lot. I use R for a lot of my coding. Except with R and Python, I don't really have to say I used R and I used Python, because when people see the code, they already know what I used. But with data, that's not the case. So one has to attribute data. So what was my, oh, sorry. So, but what is the benefits for this, right? So, researchers are always looking for data, well, especially researchers in the School for Data Science. So it gives you accessibility of data, but most importantly, no one has to replicate the data that's already out there. And if a virologist does some genomic sequence, I don't have to then worry about, do I have to do that again? And that would be an expensive proposition. So now I could access data that's already out there, free of charge, without replicating. And it fosters greater collaborations, or it should foster greater collaboration. Because when somebody does put some data out there, I should collaborate with that person in order to understand the data better. But that's not always the case, right? With government, it produces greater transparency when you put government data up as open data. And it allows for grassroots activists who do not have the sophisticated tools and databases to then access this data and form their own strategy. At the moment when data is enclosed, then grassroots activists either must go beg for data or must figure out other ways of getting data or use expensive tools to get the data. And this allows for communities to take ownership of their strategies if required. And very often, if the data is really thought carefully about, it allows for communities to take ownership of their data, rather than it being owned by everybody, but used by everybody, right? And of course, there are benefits to NPOs and NGOs, because NPOs and NGOs are not necessarily profit-making, well, they're not profit-making companies, and they could focus on core businesses rather than trying to gather data. Unless, of course, they're an NPO or an NGO meant to gather data, right? And there are benefits for private industries too, because when there is open data, then it allows for individuals to look at this data and innovate. And that's important, right? But there are some things that are a bit scary about private industry using the data, because what one can do is not spend the money on gathering the data and then use other people's data for innovation and making money for profit's sake, but then somebody else is carrying the cost of gathering the data and holding it and curating it. But we'll touch on that in a bit. Right. So let's talk about my frustrations with data. So Professor Eugene Klutter, who spoke just now, and we published some newspaper articles on Netwerk 24. I wrote it all in English and somebody translated to Afrikaans. And when you think about this kind of information or news article, I'm not in the COVID-19 research space. So I look for open data and freely available data to inform the public. And what we were trying to do is inform the public about COVID-19 in layman's terms. And one of the article, I think it's the fourth one, or the mere kritieken data nodig om pandemie te bestuur. And one of the issues was that we did not have good critical data or good quality data at that time. And this was a pandemic. And we had many highly qualified data scientists, machine learning experts, statisticians, computer scientists wanting to work on this data, but they are not expert in virology or bioinformatics and do not have access to data. And we were somewhat in that space. So here is a piece of information I thought that was quite important during that time. So South Africa has a high prevalence of various diseases, right, chronic diseases. HIV, hypertension, diabetes, active TB, cancer, and you could see the kind of percent of population that have these ailments, right? And we know comorbidity was a factor in COVID-19, especially the fatalities. So, and given South Africa's high proportion of comorbidities, surely we needed more data on this, and we needed to analyze this better. So using publicly available data, National Institute of Communicable Diseases of South Africa, we found this information. And this is the case fatality rate for various comorbidities. So 22.8% had, had high, of 22.8% of the people who had hypertension passed away. Who had also gotten COVID. So it was case fatality. Whereas if they did not have hypertension, but they had other comorbidities or no comorbidities, it would be 9.3%. Right? So I'm looking at the that graph there. If I look at the line, if you had no comorbidities, the number drops down to about 4.9%. So we know comorbidities is a factor in fatalities. And this is something we need to tell the general population out there, because then one can be even more careful. Because, you know, not everybody was careful during COVID-19, right? And we know a high proportion of the country had these comorbidities. So then we looked at this data and we found out that, you know, out of the people who are hospitalized, about 31% had 0 comorbidities, 33% had 1 comorbidity, and 36% had greater than 2 comorbidities. And of the people who had no comorbidities, 4.6% of the hospitalized passed away. Or maybe that was cases rather than hospitalized. 14.1% of those who had 1 comorbidities, and 24.4% of those who had 2 or more comorbidities. But the interesting question is not that whether you had 1 or 2, but what comorbidities and what combination of comorbidities did you have? Right. So this graph shows the impact of different combination of comorbidities. And you're right, you're seeing a blank graph because we couldn't find the data, right? And so here we are trying to inform the public on what to be careful during this pandemic, where there was a high proportion of deaths and high proportion of suffering, and we needed the pandemic to come down so that, you know, we can go back to normal life, because there was other impacts happening on people. We could not find this simple data. So, you know, I sent out some emails, tried to call some people in various Department of Health, provincial, or I don't think in national, but in provincial perhaps, you know, I didn't get any success out there, right? This is government data. This should be open to the public, unless they could prove to me that there may be misuse of this data if it's made public. And I can't imagine that this data could easily be misused. And if it could, in fact, you want to make it open to public, so then the rest of us will come and say, what are the misuses of the data when we see the misused information, right? And of course, there's always people who are worried about privacy. So of course, you know, it's easy to create privacy protected data, open data by the government, give access to all of us. I put that point at the bottom because I didn't want to block the graph that I had created or not created because of the lack of data, right? Okay, but this is not an issue just in South Africa. This is an issue everywhere in the world, right? So Transparence Santé, I think in France, they call for primary health insurance funds to open all health data to the public, right? Privacy preserved data, in other words, is not identifiable, but all health insurance data. And that allows for people to then go into the data, create, you know, it fosters greater innovation and solutions to issues in this space, right? I'm not sure how successful they have been with that, but I just wanted to say it's not a South African issue or an African issue, that you find the lack of access to open data a problem everywhere. But it is changing, right? One of the reasons why it could be an issue in Africa is African scientists, especially medical and health scientists, have been seen as a source of data but not of science. So in other words, you come here, we'll collect the data for you, then you can helicopter back off to the global north and not necessarily, you know, partake with us in the science of analyzing the data. Or sometimes it doesn't benefit the people who are part of the study directly. And so lots of African scientists are scared of open data because of the way I believe they may believe they've been used, right? But we know that science in Africa is really good. We saw that during the pandemic. I have people in the school who I think are amazing and the best in the world in what they do. I mean, if you've heard of the name Tulio de Oliveira, you know who I'm talking about. He found the South African variant of the virus. He consults to various governments on their strategy. And when he speaks to you, he'll tell you that the amazing work African scientists have been doing, right? But then there's a historical way maybe African scientists have been used when it comes to sources of data, but not of the science. But we know African science is very good. Now we need to think about African source of data, right? In 2018, a whole lot of African scientists called for more control of their continent's genomic data, because a lot of genomic data would be sequenced here or will be collected here and then flown off to wherever to be analyzed. And the benefit doesn't always filter down either to the scientists here or to the population that was of the study. Right? And there's multiple reasons why that happened. Right? So African institutions, have been low resource institutions. They still are low resource institutions, so they may never not have infrastructure to handle large data sets, except the few lucky African institutions who have access to resources. But what they wanted was they wanted a greater call for involvement of African scientists and also ethical clearance locally, because when ethical clearance happens elsewhere, the local issues are not necessarily taken into account. So, there was a different way to think about data, where it's controlled by by people here, and also, how about, and we need to think about the infrastructure available. Well, the cost of infrastructure has come down considerably, right? Because of cloud computing. I thought I was doing something magical there. But because of cloud computing and cloud storage, cost of infrastructure has come down a lot. But there are regulatory issues with that, because if you store something in the cloud and the regulators expect you to hold certain type of data within the country and not outside the country, you've got to make sure that the cloud services are holding it in, for example, in South Africa. We are lucky we have AWS and Microsoft operating out of South Africa. In fact, some of their servers are here. Therefore, we can hold it in South Africa. But then that might not be true for some of the other African countries. Right? Okay, what does this all mean for African scientists? Right? We need to develop infrastructure, and even though I say there's cloud computing, you still got to have the infrastructure around that cloud computing, the access to cloud computing. Right? And the access to how you preserve privacy while within a country, and not letting the data go out of the country without being analyzed. So in other words, could you have data sitting in different places, but have one server that does the analysis, and then the person who called the data, who called the analysis, only sees the analysis, but not the individual data in another country. And that's very doable. In fact, last year, the School for Data Science and Computational Thinking, in partnership with the Faculty of Medicine and Health Science, with University of Mbarara, Ibadan University, and another university whose name I've forgotten, as well as with MIT, Media Lab, and Harvard, we put in an application to think about, for grant, to think about how can we collect data on non-communicable diseases, but keep the data in the respective African countries, not take it out, but still be able to do analysis that will help in the overall African health being. We need greater access to education in terms of open data and access to open data, as well as thinking about, putting your data down as open data. A lot of people are still reluctant to let go of their data, right? And what it does mean when we start sharing data is greater collaboration. And when we have greater collaborations, we have better science coming out. And we see that, right? So I'm talking from my experience. I see that from the School for Data Science and Computational Thinking. And I'll talk about that with institution we just formed called SERI, with Tulio de Oliveira, or institution he formed. And of course, it allows you to leverage what you have here, rather than letting it go to another place and somebody else use the data. So when we think about open data, what is it that we need to think about? First of all, it needs to be findable. There are some open data out there, but it's not easily findable, right? And maybe the data I was looking for was out there, but I could not find it. So when researchers think about open data, they've got to think about the FAIR O principle. Sorry, I should have mentioned that first. So the F stands for findable. It's got to be findable. Secondly, accessible. So remember I talked about the infrastructure that one needs, and one must have the infrastructure to then access it. If you have open data sitting in Cape Town and somebody in Kenya wants to use it, or somewhere else, where let's say it's a rural area in some other parts of Africa or even in South Africa, and they don't have good access to data, then it's not easily accessible. Right? It's got to be interoperable. So in other words, different systems could use it as well. Right? It's got to be reusable. So if I use the data and I do some analysis, somebody else can come in and easily use it. In other words, it must be understandable. The variables or the metadata must be open for all to see quite clearly. So once you see the metadata, you know what you need, what the data is about. And of course, open license. In other words, everybody can use it as they wish with attribution. And attribution, as I mentioned this early, is important for the user to show where they got their data. Not so much, I think, for the person who actually put the data, unless they want citations. Right? So Elsevier has built this pyramid that talks about what is successful data. Right? I don't know how many people have seen this. It's new to me, at least, when I started thinking about open data. So, first level of is the data must be stored. It needs to be preserved. Somebody needs to be looking at it. It needs to be accessible. So that's the next level. It's discoverable, of what I call findable from the FAIR principle. Can people get it? Citable. How can you put attribution to it? Can I say, I got this data from this site, and this is the part of the data that I used? Comprehensible, I guess that's part of reusable, because if I don't understand the data, I can't reuse it. So are the metadata and the variables really explained well? Has the data been reviewed? I mean, that's the important part of trust, right? If the data hasn't been reviewed and I know how the data was collected, then the data might have some errors in it, right? Is the data reproducible? So explanation of how the data was collected, and then reusable on top, right? And that's really what would define successful data. And I will say that's a successful open data, because this is about putting it out there for everybody. If it's not open data, you actually don't need some of these things, right? You don't need citable, for example. So when I looked at Elsevier's DataSearch, I saw this. So here is a place where you could upload data, and you could see the wide range of data set, different types of data sets. There's images, there's documents, there's tabular data, etc. Right? But again, this is great to look for certain data, but not everything is found there, and this may not be the appropriate place for certain scientists to put their data, because we don't know where this database sits, right? So then you've got to go and think about, where does this database sit? If you look at the journals, the big journal publishers, they've all got a data journal. So not a data science journal, a data journal, where you could upload your data. I guess this is something similar to that. And there's a review process where you had to look at the quality of how you gathered the data, the quality of the data, etc. And I've reviewed twice for one of these big publishers on the data that they've been submitted, and it was a rejection like within 2 seconds, right? Because the quality of the data, the quality of how the data was gathered, the quality of the explanation of the data was really bad, which means academics themselves need to be educated on, when they gather the data and they want to publish the data, how to do it appropriately. Right. I mentioned earlier the cost, right? So there's a cost of infrastructure, but there's also the cost of implementation. So if I want to hold open data, where do I hold it, and how do I preserve it? And do I keep the server switched on for 24 hours so people can access it all the time? There's a cost associated with all that. It requires a change in mindset, because even now, most people, because of the way incentives work in academia in terms of publishing, we gather data, we keep it, and we don't let it go. We want to mine that forever. And even when we've finished mining it, we still don't want to let it go, because in case there's something else that comes up later, right? And that's the wrong incentive. And what it should be is, let it out in the open, and people who use it then attribute you in their paper. You become perhaps a co-author because you did collect the data, and therefore that worries about the number of publications one is getting goes down. And in fact, it increases drastically if many people are using your data and publishing using the data and attributing you correctly. Right? Regulatory requirements. I mean, to understand the POPI Act and to understand GDPR, etc., takes a specialist, to be honest, right? And so how can we then, when we put up open data out there, think about what are the regulatory requirements and are we fulfilling the regulatory needs, right? And the question is, whose data should be open? Should all data be open? And the answer is no. because there's lots of data out there that are really private data. And even if you wanted to take out people's identifiers, you don't want still that to be in the open. But government data should be open. We are taxpayers, and that the data created by government is paid for by us. So that should be open so that private individuals, NGOs, NPOs, businesses, etc., can then use that data to build a better quality of life for people. Right? And we don't really have great protocols on the misuse of data. So if I take some data and I interpret it in a wrong way while ignoring other factors that are in the data, there's really no protocols around that. And people are scared about misuse of data, particularly health data. Talking of misuse, we talked about exploitation of data and partisans by richer countries. So that mindset is still around, right? There is, one of the big misuses, cost of collecting, cleaning, and storing data. So I collect it, I clean it, I store it, and I spend all this money, and somebody else comes down and, uses the data and let's say creates profit out of it. That does leave a sour taste in one's mouth, right? And so how can we stop that? And how do we stop private entities from creating business out of open data without having spent money on such data, right? And I guess that's the next point, which is private entities using open data to generate revenues, while those people who had generated the data, very often government, very often NPOs and NGOs, etc., perhaps do not have the money to actually collect this data. They do it as part of their job, but if they had the revenues, they would do a better job as well, right? And of course, privacy concerns, which I mentioned earlier as well. So, but does open data really produce more research and innovation, right? I mean, one has to ask that question, right? And the answer, for me, seems clearly yes. I mean, a good example is Sloan Digital Sky Survey and the Hubble Space Telescope. They've put up their data set online for anyone to access. And people have been accessing like crazy, right? So if you think about the finite or the small number of people who work on the Hubble Space Telescope, the amount of papers they could generate or the amount of knowledge they could generate is minute. But if you think about the kind of knowledge generated by open access, by the end of January 2021, 5,600 published papers based on this data. 5,600, right? I'm sure the few people who work on all this, when I say few, probably 100 people, a lot of them technicians and engineers who are not the scientists, and if they had to publish on this, I'm sure you wouldn't get up to 5,600, right? And one could work out how many of this is extra to the people who actually work on this, right? And Professor Chris Lintott of Oxford University, he's not part of Sloan Digital Sky or Hubble Space Telescope as far as I understand. He uses this data for Galaxy Zoo project. In other words, he uses this to figure out how galaxies are formed and the speed that they are formed. So now here's open data that's opened up avenues for somebody at a great institution who can then build capacity in the area by registering students and graduating students who look at this data and think while thinking about interesting projects. It turns out lots of citizens and students and high school students use this data too, because they use this data to analyze it for their school projects and to figure out if there's new galaxies out there. I mean, how awesome is that? If you're a school kid, let's say grade 10, you get to look at this data that's out there and you could find a galaxy, right? Or some star. I don't know what exactly they look for because I've never looked at this data. But there are apparently lots of private citizens doing, looking at this data, and of course private industry too. Private industry will perhaps bring out new innovation in the astronomy space, and that's important as well. Right? Here's an example in health and medicine. So unlike the MERS and the first SARS coronavirus, it took 3 months then to sequence the virus. Here it was sequenced within days, but more importantly, it was made public to everyone. I think they gave it to the World Health Organization to make it public. So now scientists had access to the genetic sequence of the novel coronavirus, right? And because health officials could have access to that, they could then think about when they sequence one in their own country or in another place, whether it's a mutation or if it's the same strain or etc. The next generation sequences, which are also smaller, produces large amount of data. Previously, one of the reasons why, let's say, the global node did a lot of the sequencing was because it was expensive and it required large equipments. The NGS is apparently quite small and it can produce large amount of data quite quickly. What you need is then to store this data. And NextStrain is a platform where one could store this data and then do genomic surveillance to see if new strains are emerging in different places. And this has resulted in a greater number of preprints. So in other words, journal papers that are not peer-reviewed, which can be a danger in itself, but during a pandemic, you want some of the knowledge to go out there as quickly as possible. And so this has resulted in the last year and a half to a greater number of preprints in this area than we've seen previously. Right? And of course, I don't know if you guys know about Worldometer, right? Everybody must have, as soon as you put coronavirus, that's the first thing that comes up on my search, right? And that's been great because that was the source of data for lots of people on how countries are doing, not just normal citizens, but government officials, etc. I've heard so many people cite this as a piece of information. And somebody quite kind out there, I guess part of Johns Hopkins University perhaps, had put up this data set for everybody to use. It's quite a simple data, right? So because all we know is population, how many people got COVID, how many people passed away from COVID, how many people recovered, how many people are still hospitalized. Simple data, but so powerful. It told us how we were doing as a country compared to other countries and whether we were getting better or worse, etc. Right? And of course, one could use more detailed data, but this was a great start at the start of the pandemic. Right. Cape Town has an open data portal, the Cape Town city. They want to fuel investments, economic development, improve efficiency in the system. It will enable cooperation between different parts of the cities and NGOs and NPOs, etc. And of course, the data that is owned by the city is public good because it's government generated. We pay taxes, it does belong to us. They don't put up everything, right? So data that has been approved by their own policy is put up on the portal. But this is the latest data set. So it's going chronologically upwards. So on the 29th of June 2020, they put up some waste resource emission inventory, and then the next one was on 9th of September of 2021, so a year later. They put up electricity load pay profile. This is from their website. So I didn't go check if that is actually true or not, but this is what their website is saying. And that is the problem with also open data. It's expensive to upkeep, and somebody has to do it. And somebody has to then go and get the data and put it in the relevant database. And maybe that's why you're seeing that, or maybe you're seeing that because the focus moved during the pandemic, and from June of last year to September of this year, people was just busy with other stuff, or maybe just being locked down at home. I mean, let's be fair, it might have really good reasons for this. Right. So who are the stakeholders for open data? In almost everything you read, it's about libraries, academic libraries, and universities should be one of the main stakeholders of data, of open data. Of course, governments should be as well. I think of government, library, and I'll tell you who I think in the next slide, I think. But if you look at all this, the OECD reports practically lists everyone except individuals. The Royal Society says University and Research Institute, and on the EU Commission back in 2012 said it should be libraries, and they were recommended for accessing and preserving scientific information. In this case, they were looking at open data. So not just any scientific information like open publishing or open access, etc. So how can libraries enable open data? Right. So I do actually believe libraries are the forefront of enabling open data, and I think it's already happening. Right. One, libraries got to advocate and raise awareness. And those of you from South Africa, you'll remember when it came to open publishing and putting things up on the open servers, lots of people were lazy to do that because why? I've just published a paper. I'm tired as it is. I now need to do another step to do it. And then you find libraries then hounding the people. To be honest, I co-authored a paper with a colleague from University of Pretoria, and I was called multiple times to send them the paper because I was the contact author. And that's good. We need those things to be open access. We need data to be open access. And we know people are reluctant to give data as open access, but then I think it's a matter of raising awareness and how data could be used, and the fact you could be cited. That's what a lot of academics do care about when they generate new knowledge. Among many other things that they care about. Of course, giving support to infrastructure. So if I have data out there and I want to put it, open access to everybody, how do I do it? Do I create my own server to do that? Or do I give it to some sort of library services to do it? Or can someone advise me on how to do that? And I think library services sit in the point of knowledge and information that accessible to all the faculties and all the departments in the university, that they could easily do that compared to many of the other places. Right? And also, I think people admit that without the library services, they wouldn't be where they are. So just out of that, data, information, books, all belong in that space, I guess. I see this at Stellenbosch University already, policies around research data management. So how do I, when I get data, what do I do with it? How do I dispose of it if I need to dispose of it? How do I make it open access, etc.? I think that's kind of needed across all institutions, and that's probably exists in most institutions. What doesn't necessarily exist in most institutions is training and supporting researchers on open data. I think there's lots of support in other sense, but open data. Also training and supporting researchers on how to use open data, in the statistical analysis, etc. And that might not be a library service issue, but I just wanted to mention that. Without having that, then it's no use on having access to data. But that might not be a library service issue, right? So, the foster open science, they said the biggest skills gap, this was a while back though, was, when it came to open data, was advice, how to support researchers, how to data mine. So that's the, how to analyze the data that I was talking about earlier, how to develop meta schemes, in other words, how to explain the data that you have. And of course, different disciplines have different standards and practices. I used to work in finance. I used to teach finance at UCT, and finance data is very different from, let's say, genomic data or health privacy data. So, and one doesn't always know what one must do with their own data and what the standards and practices are. And one doesn't want to go to the most hardest standards and practice, because then it just becomes difficult for everyone, right? I really think partnership is key, because data is everywhere. We're in the 4th industrial revolution. We're entering the 5th industrial revolution, right? So partnership is key. So we need universities to partner within the universities and inter-university, between universities, because one could hold the data that others generate, but share in the infrastructure course. I'll give an example of what we are doing at the School for Data Science just now. Governments, I've mentioned government many times, they need to share data because I feel like it's my data. I'm paying tax for it. NGOs and NPOs should be encouraged to share data, because that could then generate more policies on how to improve qualities of life. And of course, private entities, where possible, should share data. Many private entities don't, because that's their competitive edge. Right? And data schools are important. Not just libraries. And I do think there's a place for data schools to play in the space, and I'll explain to you why. And I think it's a space that is played by both libraries and data school, not the data school alone. Whereas I think that libraries can do it alone. So the Stellenbosch University School for Data Science and Computational Thinking, or the Data School as I call it, was launched in July 2019 with a vision to be a world-class institution in data science and computational thinking in and for Africa. So we have very much a continental and a local mandate. At the moment, we have 10 researchers and 10 postdocs. By the end of the year, we should grow to 14 researchers and 13 postdocs. And that's really grown from a single person at the beginning of this year. So we've just grown fast. We've got 3 professors, Brian Ganson, Africa Center for Dispute Settlement, Bruce Watson, Chair of Computational Thinking, and Tulio de Oliveira, and he's just formed the Center for Epidemic Response and Innovation. And I want to tell you what Brian and Tulio are doing in the open data space. Right. So Brian is building a conflict barometer, and essentially what the conflict barometer does is it looks at a small geographical region and allows you to find out what is happening in that region, and or he's building that data set. But he's also going to make it quite open for people to use, because one can do multiple things, whether it's in business or in policy making, with that kind of data, right? So he's designing it for usability, so multiple different disciplinary people could come use it, and he's partnering with a private entity to host it, but ensuring that the cost of usage is very low, and it's really for the computation part and not for accessing part, right? Because I believe the institution would pay for the accessing part. For the whole storage part, right? And it will have various levels of access, so it's not fully open. So what do I mean by that? So you have data that's easily accessible for everyone, right? That should be open. They will be perhaps data that will be accessible only for the person who puts it up, but not for everyone. And the reason for that is if a government has, let's say government or private entity have some private data that they cannot share, but then they could come up with great policies as a result of incorporating with the existing data out there, we want them to be able to do it. Right? And if it's, of course, private entities, I'm sure there's a payment method if it's a profit-making private company. And then there might be data out there that is got highly confidential. Some parts of it could be shared if it's an aggregated format, but not in its raw individual format. For example, health data might be one of those. Right? So we're already building that. We're having conversations actually on Thursday on seeing what the structure would look like, and it would be open for everyone to use. Right? And we would welcome everyone across the globe once it's set up to use it, because if we have a central repository for usage, then we can collaborate better, easier and better as well. And then you start creating standards for what it would look like. And what this tool is underpinned by is by small geographical level, or at geographical level. They don't even have to be small. The system should figure out at the size of the geographical level. Tulio de Oliveira, he formed CERI, the Center for Epidemiological Research and Innovation. And what he's done in the last year and a half, he's been at the coal face of COVID-19 research. And what they've done is there's been greater sharing of genomic data within Africa. So, somebody will sequence the data and will share it out quite freely. And this has resulted in identifying new variants very quickly. Because if you think about it, certain countries or certain regions might be really good at sequencing, or they do have the facility to sequence. It might not be necessarily even better than anyone else, but they might be really good at, they might have the facility to sequence. And then you get other regions that have the scientific ability at the moment to then figure out if there's a new variant, etc. So you want to be sharing in order to build better health outcomes. Right? And this has resulted in really good collaborations and world-class outputs. I mean, I think Tulio in the last 12 months has published a whole series of science journal articles, Nature journal articles, New England medicine article, etc. I mean, it's a bit crazy, I think. But the only reason one could do that is because of the kind of collaboration he's created with his partners across the continent and outside the continent, right? And then because we need greater data generation skills and analysis skills, he is bringing in dozens of people from other countries to show them how to do some of these analysis and how to generate some of this data, so that, to put it in simpler terms, we spread the love everywhere. And that's what open data is about, right? We want everybody to use it and everybody to share it, right? And he really lives it, right? So I see my time is up, and it's at a good point to come to my final remarks, right? So what I've talked about is really started off with my experience of lack of data, that I couldn't find data. And then I just went into why open data would have helped with some of those things. I do believe open data would also help with fighting some of these fake news and fake information, because if data is easily accessible, there are enough people out there with knowledgeable science who would then come and show what is true and what is not true. What is really needed but is not there at the moment, is open data policies for emergent issues. So we had coronavirus, and 3-4 months later, I was still struggling to get some basic data. How are we going to respond when the next pandemic hits? How are we going to respond when the next issue hits? Let's say it's a cyclone that comes through Stellenbosch, and open data would be useful for people to offer solutions to the issues that comes out of the cyclone. We don't have policies and protocols or ways of being for emergent issues. At least I don't think so. Library services and higher education institutions, I think, should be the forefront of African open data initiatives, because higher education institutions, and more specifically the research libraries within them, have access to government, have access to a whole lot of researchers, have access to NGOs and NPOs, or can create that access easier than people or other entities, and I think that's why libraries and HEIs should be in the forefront, right? And open data should include, not just storage. It's about computation, data curation, how do you look after the data, and something I haven't put there, which is analysis of data. So how do we educate people to do this analysis quite easily? So if I go back to Brian Ganson's Barometer, that tool would have tools within itself which would then analyze it for you based on what you're looking to do. Right. So in other words, I don't have to actually go and learn every tool out there. I don't have to be a graduate, let's say, of the School for Data Science, even though I would encourage everyone to be, to go and then do this analysis. And this will, given the resource gap in Africa, where not everybody has access to be able to do storage, computation, data curation, partnerships is important, and collaboration is important. That way we can spread out the technological benefits that we have within some regions and expertise in other regions, etc. We share people and we share resources, right? I mentioned earlier it's important to partner with governments, researchers, HEIs, and private entities for Africa's open data initiatives. I don't think it could be done by itself. So if the two examples from the School for Data Science is very much a collaboration between us and many other entities. There are lots of great grassroots organizations that could access and ingest this data, but they don't have the know-how of how to analyze the data, and that's where the analysis part comes in. How do we then train people easily to be able to use this standardized open data to then go ingest it and analyze it so they can influence macro policies themselves? With that, I say thank you. I'm really grateful to have been given this opportunity to present to you. Thank you.
It had really, I think everybody, probably been listening to you, were really encouraged, but just to make us think about, some of the things, yes, we have heard about, but to have it presented like this, it makes you think about what we're doing, what can we do, to help with the situation, and how can we actually get something done. And I think that is what is so important from what you presented. So if you have come here that you're just going to listen to something, you can hear here you are being called basically to action, and that is so good. So I also remember when Kanshu did a presentation earlier this year, where he invited all the different environments and faculties to introduce the school after it has now been officially launched and started its work. When he started off and he introduced or explained to the university community about the school, what the school is, and in terms of the role, the position of the school. And I went back and I told my senior management team, I said, well, this is the best thing that I have heard when the library was mentioned, because he explained that the school is actually going to be regarded as a faculty. So we have 10 faculties, and the school will be the 11th faculty. It will have the same status as a faculty at the university, and he explained that by saying, similar, it's like the library, the library, which is, multidisciplinary. It serves all the faculties, and I thought, well, that's great. Placing us basically saying we are also a faculty at the university, so an interdisciplinary faculty. So I was really pleased to hear that. And he had demonstrated that again this morning by making it so practical in terms of, where libraries fit in, and of course covering the whole university, society, government, everything in which what our job is really about as information professionals. So thank you very much for that. So I know we have had 45 minutes for tea, but I am going to give an opportunity just to hear if there's one or two questions before we break for tea. And Marie, you're going to do the announcements, the housekeeping announcements. But just before we do that, yes, any questions? Okay. Oh, there are 3 hands. We'll take all 3, just those 3. Start with Shireen.
Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. So I was going to ask you a question, but you addressed it in your closing remarks about the libraries. But now I'm going to ask you something more important, I think. So I was wondering while you were talking, libraries have been at the forefront of open access, and it's gone almost 10 years, and we are still driving the agenda. But what I wanted to ask is maybe as citizens or as community and as the university, I see in the pandemic that we have become much, much more stronger in terms of our value as collaborators. And for me, that is something that we need to galvanize and perhaps push government and into the politics of maybe in terms of data. But I'm asking what did we get wrong in terms of changing culture and ethos to open?
Cool. Oh, I've got the mic. Good question. Should I wait for all the 3 questions? Or?
Maybe if you don't mind, yeah. So
Okay.
I'm going to give Isak a chance and Wouter, and then we have also from 1 or 2 virtual questions.
Right. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you for the fantastic presentation as well. What is the sort of deterrent for people when it comes to misuse? Because, I mean, we see a lot of misuse, but nothing's being really done about that. I mean, let's just take an example of call centers phoning you with your data and just that misuse. There's no deterrent, there's no repercussion for that. So my question is basically, what do you propose, or what's the solution to the misuse of the data?
Okay. And then just one more, Wouter, and then we'll take, then you can answer those, and then we'll take the ones from the virtual delegates.
Yes, thank you. I think libraries have done a lot to perhaps meet your requirements, and it would require some discussion to show what we've done. But the question I have is, how do we know what data you want and in what format? It's a bit of an open question, but yeah.
Okay, cool. Great question. So let me start with the first one. How do we continue with the collaborations that's been happening, and how do we bring more people into the fold, right? I mean, there's no easy answer to it. I think, one of the things is when we go out of the pandemic, people go back to their old ways of doing things. But I think lots of people who, I want to use the word, taken advantage of the pandemic, and where they've collaborated to produce better science, better policies, would continue to do so. And if we make them the model of being, then I think younger people will fall into that. So, one of the things I've seen in academia is almost model of being and mentorship. If you have the wrong model, then you fall in the wrong way of being. And I think we've got to showcase the kind of the great stuff people like Brian Ganson, Bruce Watson, Tulio de Oliveira, and that's just from the school. I'm sure there's everywhere, but I like to talk about the school first. Are doing, and I think if we can model that, then we'll be in a better place. But you're right, it's difficult, especially with government, because government would like to hold on to data as much as possible. At least that's the impression they give. We need to change that. We are the citizens, and we need to think about how to change that. I don't really have an answer for it, but I think these are things that we need to think about. Sorry, now I've forgotten the second question was on misuse of data. So there is a lot of misuse of data, and there's potential for lots of misuse of data. So you've seen things like the POPI Act being enacted, etc., which reduces some of that. What we don't have a good definition is what is actual misuse of data, right? You might not want a call, but I might actually want that call because I like getting these, I can't imagine anyone like that, but there might be somebody who likes to get calls from insurance companies so they could reduce their premium, right? Surely we can build a better system that allows for that, right? So I do think there could potentially be technological solutions as well as legislative solutions for this, but we need to put greater thought to it. As with any technological advancement, policy and government, they're always at the back end, right? So they come later, and that's what we are coming to now, thinking about what should be these policies and even technological advancement that could deal with some of these things. And we've seen some of it. POPI Act is a great one. But I think that you're right, there's greater ways of doing it. And we've seen technological advancements too, right? Because I just got a new phone the other day, and I could block all unknown numbers, or numbers that are known to be highly, call center-y kind of numbers. So that's a technological advancement. But that's a very narrow sense. What you mean is in a much broader sense of misuse. And I think there are some use cases, but one has to go back and look at, one has to develop policies and interventions for various kinds of misuses. The misuse that scares me the most is a misuse of health data. Right? And you were asking about, sorry, I've got a short memory. Great question. So one of the problems is how data is stored and curated, right? So I'm talking about the shape of data first before I talk about what data. So data sometimes is not in the form that one needs it, and that's why if you start getting bigger open access databases, I think those kind of policies standardization policies would come into being, and they already do exist. So when I do upload into, let's say, one of these databases, it's got to be in a certain manner. I've got to explain it in a certain manner. But I think as we do more of it, that would become more into being. But the first part on what data, really, that's really hard, because one is every disciplinary area is evolving and wanting more and different types of data. So that is why the encouragement of making as much open data as possible in the right format, which you mentioned, would solve some of that, right? But it would also mean large databases and costs, right? But at a minute detail, it's hard to say what data would be important, because I think every discipline would be very different. So if I think about finance and the kind of data you get from these financial databases, sometimes the way it's given to me, I cannot use it for what I want to do, right? But I know the data, raw data exists at the back end, right? So it's how do they share the back-end data? Of course, with finance, it's a service they're providing, so it's a profit-making companies, a lot of these databases. But for things like government data, etc., we should think about how to standardize it and how to make as much of it accessible as possible. And that's the beauty, to be honest, of data science as well, because what you want to do in data science is not just to use the usual data to try to explain something. You want to use data that's never been used before. And therefore you need all data, because you don't know what you can find, provided there is a causality relationship. Right.
Okay. Cool. Thank you, Marie. I don't see the questions. So while we're just going to take one or two questions from the virtual delegates, of whom 91 are with us this morning, there was one question, but I think you won't be able to answer that to me that I had. When you showed us the blank screen, because I remember since last year, what we keep people wondering, why is the government not giving us the data about COVID, about the deaths, about in terms of whereas everything else we're usually so quick to give the statistics in terms of race. You know, but up till today, we have still not seen, read, heard anything about that, as well as probably also in terms of rich and poor. So you've heard in America, a lot of the statistics, you know, they have commented on that, but there was just no word, nothing
Sure.
about anything.
So race wins politics, right? And unfortunately in South Africa that's the case, so one does show race, or government or political parties like to show racial data. When it comes to the COVID-19 data, what I heard was a lot of the people who generated wanted to keep the data to able to mine it for themselves, so they can publish it and create policies in their name. And that's the wrong incentive, in my opinion. Some of them worked really hard to get the data, and I can understand as a person, you know, you work really hard to get the data, and you don't want to share it. Now, if you're not employed by the government, so like a private entity or a university, I think that's more excusable. But if you are working for a government entity, that data is not just your data. I believe it's everybody's data. If a bank creates some data that they went and mined and they figured out, that's different. You know, they're a private entity. So I think it's just we need to change our ways of thinking about open data and how to take, I want to say, reach the same goals and have the same incentives that you'd have without sharing it, or even better incentives. So in academia, one of the better incentives is that if you share it, you might end up with more publications, and that's what a lot of academics want, right? So.
Okay, so we've got one here. How does one account for the quality of open data when the data are not actually curated or peer-reviewed prior to publication? You've mentioned there was this increase in preprints. This has relevance. This has relevance in the case of open data associated with the COVID-19 pandemic as inaccurate open data, which can, of course, lead to misinformation.
Cool. So I do think for that, you don't have a private individual sharing open data, because we don't know how they got it and what they're sharing even. You need to have respected institutions like governments are respected, government, university, etc., sharing it, because I think that is really important, because they know how they generated the data, etc. Of course, there's opportunity. They should need to curate the data, so they also need to explain both how they obtain the data and what is in the data. But it also allows for one to question the data. And I think that's important. It's not a one-way conversation about data. Here is open data. In fact, when you do analysis, what you're doing essentially is questioning what's in the data, right? And so one does need a workforce, or I don't know what it is, that allows you to question data.
Okay, another one, which data storage platforms we could consider buying as libraries, or are they open platforms?
So I don't want to fight with our cloud computing providers. We play with everyone. I do think cloud computing is the way to go, right? Because that's where data is stored and easily retrievable. And if we go into another lockdown, then you can retrieve it again. And library services have been really good at that, right? Because everything is on the cloud. Right? And I think using any of those cloud services that fits in with data storage and data computation of data, it would be the right way to go. Yeah. Right.
Okay. Well, I have to read this for the virtual delegates as well, and then, of course, for the audience here. Maybe you understand it. I don't quite understand it, but fortunately you have to answer it. You mentioned deduplication as an advantage of open data. Very much agreed. What are your thoughts on the notion of tell us once, where institutions, government is mandated to never ask the same question twice?
So I guess one could interpret that question in many ways, right? So the way, can we go back down a little bit? So the way I'm interpreting is government wants to tell you their thoughts once and not be questioned on it. Is that the way, I see nodding of head. Well, going back to, I think, a previous statement that I said, one should be able to question data and one should be able to question anything, actually, right? Of course, if if the answer to that question has been resolute and it's convincing, then you can't be knocking on again, asking the same question as sometimes I get from people who are very much against vaccine in all its form, and with new kinds of information that actually doesn't make sense. But I do think, especially government, we should be allowed to question them till no end, just because we are the citizens and we are looking out for the better of the country, and we're trying to help them form a better society and better outcomes for society. Hopefully we are, and therefore we should be able to ask those questions. I don't think we should take that from government or institutions, not just in open data, but in anything. We should be able to ask questions, right? And that's what a democratic process is all about, I guess, right?
Okay, so I'm going to take 3 more minutes because this really seems to be quite a few interesting questions coming up. Open data and greater transparency are great aspirations for our country. Could you comment on transparency in decision processes? We are doing some work in cyber warfare defense in which manipulation of the process is the new Achilles heel.
So I could even guess who asked that question. So you're right. Open data and greater transparency are great aspirations for the country because we need to be more transparent. Very often decision makers are not transparent on the process of decision making, as well as the data they used for decision making. If you make the data available, then I could look at the data and perhaps show that a better decision could be made. So even if the process of decision making is not transparent, or why they came to that conclusion or decision is not transparent, open data allows us to question that. And that's really useful. With warfare, it's a little bit different because warfare is a little bit like health, where some of it is privately held by government for the greater good, and sometimes not held by government not for the greater good. So, and I don't know how to answer that. And I think, at places like Stellenbosch University and the school, there's lots of people looking at the ethics of data science at the university, as we have also partnership at the school that looks at ethics of data science, and that is the ethics of data and how data is used and how one makes decisions from that and how transparent it should be. And I'm not an ethicist, so I'm unable to answer that question, but I think that's a great question to be posed for research on how to make decision making to be more transparent.
Okay, so this is the last one. The market-driven approach says those who pay gain access and those who use the most define the agenda. So in the SA context, with poor education and dodgy state capacity to process and apply information, there seems little incentives to push for advances on data sharing.
This is true. But we have some, I believe, powerful players who can talk to the government. And I was fortunate enough to talk to them today. Right? Higher education institutions and library services, I think, are like I said, are the most appropriate people to talk to the government so that data is given, access to data is given in a manner that's usable by everyone, from grassroots level, as I mentioned earlier, to the highest level. Right? And I think we have less incentives in general than private entities or the people who are paying for the data. And in fact, I'm saying we shouldn't be paying for the data. Government should make that accessible to all of us. So payment shouldn't be an issue. But take out the powerful players who do have money, put in universities who don't have money, and let them lead the agenda. Right?
Thank you
Thanks
much.
for listening to me.
Marie will just make a few announcements in terms of housekeeping, and then we will be ready for tea. Everybody, hope you at home have your coffee also ready. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. I don't think I have much to say. I think the most important thing is that the bathrooms are to the left when you go out. And here are just a few people that still need to tell us what they will choose on the menu for lunch. Just come up to me if you haven't done so yet. It's Ilse and Shalene and Nomambulu and Nomatangu. Thank you. Just come to me afterwards. And I think if you could come back a little bit before 11 so that we can start at 11, that would be great. And as for the protocols for COVID-19, just as much as possible, keep your masks on. There are sanitizers everywhere. And I think that's that for now. The rest we will communicate later if needed. Right, thank you.